At the institutional level, we see racism play out in both the written rules and the unwritten rules of that institution.
I went to Lionel Wilson College Preparatory Academy. First high school built in Oakland in 40 years. Funded by many donations, it was clearly not no ghetto school. Though they placed in the middle of Brandy Park, East Oakland on 105th. For those who missing this, that would be the ghetto. So those who ran it were continuously shocked and appalled at the daily tagging appearing in the halls, the block signs scraped in the walls, and the rocks tossed so frequently through windows. What did they expect? Should have known you can't take the ghetto out of a kid even if you place them in a clean-cut environment, because they will do anything to remove dissonance. So when you're used to crack vials lining your walkways and everything you own is a step past shitty, you really ain't trying to see nothing pretty.
White boy who walks in the room and is animated and moving around and maybe even a little cheeky is smart. And isn't he smart? Isn't he cheeky? He's almost looked at as, well, boys will be boys. A boy of color, especially an African-American boy who walks in the room exhibiting the same behavior, walks in and it's, I might need to keep an eye on him. We are afraid of these young boys, and I'm talking young boys, 4 years old and above. And that instead of the teacher looking at him or herself and saying, what is going on with me, that this same behavior creates fear in me instead of admiration, we pathologize the boy of color.
Jump shot.
No, look, I want to get over there.
Dance.
No, listen, I need to get over there.
Crack.
No, I'm sorry, look, I just want to get over there.
Rap.
No, I need to get over there.
Hey, man, show me your jump shot. Show me your jump shot. Rap for me. Dance.
Just stop.
There was no place for us in school. I would argue that the greatest waste of time in my life was the 4 years I spent in high school. And this is coming from an educator. That there was, from the food we were fed to the only way we were really accepted in school, you know, the black boys are the mascots of any high school that they're in where I grew up. I don't know about other places. I've seen it in other places, though. I see it now at universities. Well, like the black dudes are, the, you know, they're the provocative part of your experience in high school or college or in the workplace, you know. And for me, it didn't speak to me. Race always deals with boxes, right? And I think when we are, so let's say you grow up in the suburbs, you know, or you grow up in an affluent area in a city that has an affluent area and a ghetto, but you're black, a black boy. And so you get to school, and there's a box for you, and that box says you rap, you're an athlete, you're slightly to highly misbehaved, you're not involved or into your education that much, you sell and or use drugs. That's the box that you're accepted in. And in order to play ball, no pun intended, that's how you interact with yourself, your own identity, and this is how you're cool. But you feel like the box that it traps you in is you feel like to be healthier, to be in a more sound mind state, to think and know and come from a place of foundation in your life is something that you have to be ashamed of and you have to denounce. It can drive you crazy.
So a good example is our current foreclosure crisis and the housing crisis. What happened there is that 30, 40 years ago, you had banks making very explicit racial decisions not to loan to people of color, and particularly not to loan to people who are trying to integrate neighborhoods. That kind of explicit racism was outlawed by the Community Reinvestment Act and by some other civil rights laws. But what came up in their place is a whole range of new financial institutions, and those folks began to make what are now known as subprime loans. And they went to the communities that had very little access to traditional mortgages. Their behavior, their lending practices, created a racist impact. It created a tremendous loss of wealth and a huge foreclosure crisis in communities of color. But we couldn't address it because they weren't saying explicitly we're targeting these people because of their race. So we need to have a sense of racism as it works through our rules and regulations, or our lack of rules and regulations, even if no one is intentionally trying to be racist.
There is a sort of seductive myth and undercurrent of this whole idea of post-raciality, that like the answer is everyone should have, you know, relationships across race and then everything's going to go away. Particularly in the Bay, you know, you get that. You see a lot of couples who are raced differently. Like you go down the lakeshore and there's lots of beautiful babies everywhere. And so some people would point to that as like, hey, mountaintop, here we are. And I think that so often we talk about the interpersonal when it comes to race, when we need to be talking about the structural also.
In all the social justice work I've done, as I look at who was making the decision about that transportation project, that job training program, very rarely do the people who are making the decisions come from the communities that those decisions are going to impact. So they are not representative of those communities, and more often than not, they are also not even responsive to those communities. I really became so focused on the different access to resources and opportunities that different people have, and how that influences what happens generation after generation after generation. What makes places the places that they are? Who decided that? And where's the money going?
At the structural level, you're understanding the relationship between those different kinds of institutions. So you understand that housing segregation, for example, affects school financing. And so housing segregation is going to generate segregation in schools, and it's going to generate uneven education for kids of color. And so if you only try to intervene in education with the education institutions, you're only going to make limited progress, because we know that the housing institutions also affect what happens in schools.
I like the idea of living in a multiracial community so that my children can get to know lots of different people and feel comfortable in all these different cultures and be able to go out into the world comfortable with that. But on the other hand, I'm also challenged because I really need my child to have a really good education. And so in order to have a good education, they need to live in a neighborhood where they can go to a good school. And a good school is determined by how much tax that school is able to collect. And I have to make choices about that. So then say I make the decision to buy a house in a good neighborhood so my child has a good education. Chances are that neighborhood is less racially diverse. Then that means that my child will not have the same kinds of intraracial experiences growing up that I had living in a city where when my parents had fewer choices that were related to my father's immigration status, or not status, but the fact that he was an immigrant, and that it was harder for him to find good work, which limited where we could live. I may value racial diversity, but given that wealth and access to schooling is so closely linked to home ownership in this society, I don't have to be racist in the traditional sense of the word, of not liking somebody who's not like myself, to actually be carrying on that tradition.
Structural racism, the first part of it is that you're looking multiple institutions and you're looking at the culture, the morals, the aspirations, the ideas, the language, the images, all of those things that comprise a culture. But the other parts are that you're paying very serious attention to history, because that's the way structural racism works, that history matters.
So I'm 21, right? And I find out that there's this distant relative of mine who once upon a time was the governor of Mississippi. J.P. Coleman, he's the governor between 1956 and 1960. Mind you, he was elected into office 4 months after Brown II. And one of the first things he did was set up the State Sovereignty Commission and sort of be in cahoots with the Citizens Council, and try to use the law to preserve Mississippi's way of life, to subvert Brown through aracial, legalistic means. In the archives, I was reading this letter that, to me, echoed of a sort of Ward Connerly colorblind approach to the law as a way to ensure that racialized hierarchies of power continue and are upheld. And the letter was basically one of, in 1956 Mississippi, looking to remove the language of race from the law so as to maintain segregated schools. In my opinion, it was, incredibly insidious, but also what made it so that by the end of his term, there were still separate schools.
The reality is, if you're not part of the power structure, you're not one of the ones making the decision, I think you're hyper aware of what's happening. You're hyper aware of the decisions that are being made and how they impact you. And